Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Makin Sense, South Africa and the world's best news podcast and the Common Sense's flagship podcast. In this show, we gather a panel of brilliant South Africans who live scattered around the world to discuss the most important South African and global news stories and ideas of the week. What a show we have ahead of us today. We're going to be talking about Venezuela, the two threats to the GNU in 2026, the shift in the American political attitudes, the battle over free speech, the new NPA boss, and whether the Iranian regime will survive. But before we get to all of that, let me introduce you to our panel of brilliant South Africans from across the globe. Joining us from Germany, where he is gathering a group of hobbits to begin a perilous quest, the director of the Bremen Democracy Research Group, the Gandalf the Grey of Groppelingen, James Myberg. From Germany, we are off to the United Kingdom, where we find our UK correspondent rejecting the throne he was born to. He is the Aragorn of Acton, Simon Lincoln Reeder. And from the UK, we head across the Atlantic to the United States, as we are joined by the Common Sense's Washington correspondent, who is preparing her shield for battle, the Eowyn of the East End, Reina Opperman. And we are finally off to South Africa, from where we are joined by the Common Sense's editor, who is expounding on what a potato is. Boil 'em, mash 'em, stick 'em in a stew. He is the founder of France Crenier Private Clients, the Samwise Gamgee of Sandhurst, France Crenier. And ladies and gentlemen, as always, I am your host, coveting my precious, the column of gardens, Gabriel Makin. So we're going to start the show this week with, I think, the biggest news story of the week, and that is Trump's successful operation to abduct the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro. So, Reina, can you tell us what has happened in Venezuela?
Thank you, Gabriel. So, in the early hours of December 3rd, the United States Special Forces carried out a surgical operation in Caracas, where the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife were arrested and flown to New York. Maduro now faces trial in the US on charges of drug trafficking and narco-terrorism. President Trump has said that the US will temporarily run Venezuela and oversee a careful transition, including bringing in American companies to revive the country's struggling oil sector. This is an extraordinary moment. So, how did Venezuela get here? Maduro came to power in 2014 after the death of Hugo Chavez. He inherited and deepened a state-led socialist system built around nationalized industries, tight political control, and heavy dependence on oil. Under Maduro, the economy collapsed. Venezuela's GDP shrank by 50%. More than 8 million people fled the country, state institutions were hollowed out, and criminal networks moved into the heart of government. Today, Maduro is seen as a dictator whose rule is denied by more than 60 countries. What makes Venezuela unique, though, is that it has the world's largest proven oil reserves. However, after the oil industry was nationalized in the 70s, its production has largely collapsed. Venezuela could once produce about 4 million barrels of oil a day, and today it produces just under 1 million. So for context, that's about 6% of American oil production. So from Washington's perspective, Maduro was not just a failed leader, but the head of a criminal state. The US designated him as the leader of Cartel de los Soles, which it describes as a state-run drug trafficking network and terrorist organization accused of moving cocaine into the Americas using state infrastructure. This designation formed the legal basis for US action, framed by the Trump administration as anticipatory self-defense against a criminal regime. But this, of course, goes way beyond drugs. In Washington's view, Venezuela had become a strategic platform for American adversaries. Russia, Iran, and China all gained outsized influence in the country. Around 80% of Venezuela's oil has been going to China at discounted prices, and Iranian-backed militia networks have operated freely within the country. So this is where geopolitics comes in. What we're really seeing is a return to a spheres of influence thinking. The arrest of Maduro fits squarely into America's push to maintain dominance in the Western Hemisphere, something the Trump administration has linked to a modern take on the Monroe Doctrine, sometimes called the Donroe Doctrine under President Trump. Marco Rubio, who is the US Secretary of State, puts it quite bluntly. He says, "This is the Western Hemisphere, this is where we live, and we're not going to allow the Western Hemisphere to be the base of operation of adversaries and competitors of the United States." As simple as that. So the arrest has sparked sharp criticism globally. Some governments, including America's allies, argues it violates international law and the United Nations Charter. Many critics go as far as to say that it reflects imperialist tendencies. However, this interference claim, one can argue, collapses under scrutiny. A good counterpoint argument is a quote that I'd like to grab from Dr. Corneille Mulder from the Freedom Front Plus, and he puts it in this way. He says, "It was necessary to dismantle a regime that not only terrorized its own people, but also posed a threat to the region and the world. National sovereignty cannot be a shield for such atrocities. That would be a license for tyranny." So in this framing, the US holding Maduro accountable is overdue justice, not imperialism. So that's a summary of what has just transpired.
So, Simon?
Sure. Sorry, I don't want to preempt any further discussion that Raina may have, but just looking at that international reaction, you've mentioned Dr. Corneille Mulder, which I thought was very elegant, eloquent. Doesn't it show you, Raina, and you study these things, doesn't it show you that if Britain was if the UK, which has for the longest time shared this powerful alliance in the Anglosphere with America, and before Ronald Reagan invaded Grenada, he phoned Margaret Thatcher. She wasn't apparently too happy about it, but he nonetheless alerted. He went on this thing alone. He didn't tell anyone. The UK had to wait like a Sky News journalist at Mar-a-Lago for that press conference. I think that's something that we should look at here, because it really indicates that firstly that relationship is nothing. But America is alone in these things. It's going its own way. And yeah, I thought that was really clear from this exercise.
Absolutely, Simon. And I think what it speaks to largely, to add on to that, is the fracturing in a global civil fabric. You have a world going into two different directions, one that is anti the US and especially Trump and his way of conducting business, and his stance, and one that would say that this is an imperial overreach. But of course, the diplomatic side of it, how the US speaks to its allies and informs its allies of these of major acts, of course, can be improved.
Yeah, so Raina, I wanted to follow up on what you were talking about, because I want to ask you, what has been the fallout of the seizure and abduction of Nicolas Maduro inside of Venezuela?
Thanks, Gabriel. So to speak about what's happening currently, so Delcy Rodriguez is Venezuela's vice president, and she has now been sworn in as interim president. She's seen as a canny political operator, and she's become Washington's pick for the transition, largely because she controls the country's oil portfolio, and she has real experience dealing with international oil companies. So Trump has made it clear that reviving Venezuela's broken oil industry is central to US plans, and said that US companies will lead the effort to rebuild the country's energy sector. What's interesting is that the Wall Street Journal actually reported that officials had American officials had quietly been discussing Rodriguez as the preferred lead figure in a post-Maduro government long before the raid. So even in scenarios where Maduro might have stepped aside voluntarily, which America gave him ample opportunity to do. So what this reflects in US thinking is that they want someone in power who can stabilize the country, that knows about the oil industry, and that can revive production quickly. But at the same time, sorry, France, Rodriguez is no reformer. She's a left-wing hardliner, and she's a longtime critic of Washington, and she falls very much into Maduro's mold. And her initial response to Maduro's arrest was defiant, and she announced the US action as imperialist aggression. But Rodriguez has since shifted her tone. She issued a media statement calling for peace, seeking US cooperation on shared development. So I'd say that Washington doesn't see her as an ideological partner, but as the most workable instrument for delivering immediate stability.
France?
I take issue with your language, Gabriel. You've said it twice. He was abducted. You don't abduct a drug dealer who sells a crack to school children. You arrest him and bring him to justice. And that's what's occurred here. Sovereignty, if you think about what it means, and this is apparently the thing Trump has now violated, the sovereignty of Venezuela, in the broader sense, means the ability of a state to conduct its own affairs in a way that it chooses. But when you've crashed your economy, you've evacuated the middle classes, terrorized people, stolen elections. GDP is down by more than 50% during Maduro's term. You've already ceded sovereignty, and so that's step one. You ceded your own sovereignty, and that put you in a position where your legitimacy was so eroded that you became vulnerable to the action that the US eventually took. Second point to make is that this wasn't just a commercial drug venture, selling drugs. That there was an element of that. But the drug dealing was intentionally driven to destabilize the United States from within, as drugs are well able to do. And the proceeds were used to resource groups that actively threatened the interests of the US from without and US allies. And if you read the broader Western media, you've read a lot about sovereignty this week, and this is a precedent on Taiwan and a precedent on whatever else. But that's a lot of nonsense. China wasn't waiting for a legal precedent before it decided what to do with Taiwan. It's long decided what it will do with Taiwan. It will blockade it and eventually seize it, and there's nothing anyone can do about that. And after that, it will come for Australia. It doesn't need a legal precedent. And if you cannot distinguish, not you now, I'm talking about the Western media. I only had an issue with your term abduction. If the Western press or people, commentators, Keir Starmer, whatever, cannot distinguish between a democratic state like the US acting clearly in its own defense and the best interests of its citizens via liberating, to an extent, a country from a cruel dictator like that, and on the one hand, and let's use the issue of Taiwan or Ukraine or whatever you want to use, then you really have no business writing in the global media. So I think this was a totally legitimate action, completely consistent with international law, totally justified in terms of the US best interests, and totally in the best interests of Venezuelans themselves, which is why they have welcomed the action. And I read more today in the press. Trump is going to take Venezuela's oil. That's false. The Americans will buy Venezuelan oil and pay for it with money, and use that and I'm slightly informed on this, use that raising the Venezuelan oil economy, helping it to recover, use that as a catalyst to drive up living standards in that country so that it becomes a stable regional ally of the US and not a source of immigrants and criminality and drugs as it has been. So, I mean, I just say in every respect, this was a wholly legitimate, justified, morally correct action in the best interest of the US, the West broadly, and Venezuelan people themselves, and it should be celebrated and the Americans congratulated.
Yes, I apologize that the word abduction think does have a certain moral character. I don't disagree with anything that you said. I think that Trump was entirely correct, especially because we've mentioned kind of a lot of the Venezuelan the tyranny that Maduro inflicted upon his people. But when you call Nicolas Maduro a drug kingpin, that is entirely accurate. He used his own military resources to allow for the distribution of drugs across these networks. He allowed traffickers to use the military paths. He was encouraging the distribution of drugs, and then as well as that, as a means of suppressing dissent, he would then call in when protests would break out in Venezuela over something like hyperinflation, which they have seen. He would then call in the gangs to abduct and torture a few dissidents, and make a public display of what happens if you mess with me. But he would use the gangs as shield for saying, no, it's not us, it's these gangs, it's not the Venezuelan government. Although he was resourcing, arming, and providing succor to these gangs. So it is an entirely legitimate exercise. I agree with you entirely. But we're going to go to you, James.
Yeah, I've just got a question: is why did they not go for regime? Well, why did they go for trying to pressure the regime to change, rather than a full-blown sort of color revolution, regime change kind of operation, as in previous eras?
Your question is why they didn't topple the whole regime, only cut the head off and put Rodriguez in charge?
Yeah, so rather than a total, they haven't, they're not in. I don't know what their sort of move number 5 is, but currently they're not pushing for the opposition leader to take over. They want the regime to reform, to shift policy, rather than to try and overthrow it completely.
James, I would say that the US is looking for a practical solution with the best possible outcome in the near term. So somebody like Rodriguez, I think they've identified a long time ago, to be able to manage this transition. They think that she's the best placed person to do it. And so that's what I would say. It's a practical situation from the United States to do an interim transitionary government. And then perhaps down the line, I don't know, France, if you can speak to this, but for the moment, this is, I think, what makes sense for the United States to do in a peaceful, practical manner.
Yeah, I think that's right. James, I think there were a few things. One, I think Rodriguez was very well researched ahead of time. And, she's got an interesting family background, which you can kind of understand her left-wing sense of things. Parents and so had been through a tough time from the relative right and South America's complex past. And I think the calculation on her was that she was ruthlessly power hungry. And if she was given the opportunity, she would become a very useful ally to the United States. And that she was certainly a hardcore leftist, probably is to some extent, but she could be made to be pragmatic and to do the two critical things. There were two objectives here. One, stop the threat to U.S. national security. They felt they can rely on her to do that. And two, help to rebuild the oil industry so that Venezuela can again be prosperous. And then America can have prosperous neighbors and all those security and social problems that flow across the American southern border as a consequence of countries like Venezuela not being prosperous go away. There were two objectives. Both are met. There was not really a third objective to instill some sort of new ideological framework, anything of that nature. And part of that, I think, was just the logistics of it. To remove an entire administration and replace it with an entirely new one, including flying in the exiled leaders, is just very difficult to do and could lend itself to instability. It's much simpler just to decapitate the head of the thing and know, because you've done your research, that the 2IC is likely to be someone that you can work with to attain your strategic objectives. That's a critical thing. What were the strategic objectives? Stop the security threats. Let's find a way to rebuild the economy to our mutual advantage. Thus far, both those objectives are being met. And Rodriguez has even released a statement which was fine. She said, she looks forward to working with Trump and America to rebuild the Venezuelan economy. So far, the plan seems to be working.
James?
What exactly, what hard actions is she required to take in terms of national security, in terms of, I don't know, there's talk about, all these Iranian proxy groups having a base in Venezuela, a lot of, funding of, clearly Venezuela funds a lot of anti-Western organizations and parties around the world, maybe even in South Africa. So what hard steps have to be implemented?
Cut off the funding to the Iranian proxy groups, isolate them and pursue them so they don't have a free operating space inside your country. Take on the drug gangs which were associated and deal with them in a way that they cannot easily thrive, and create an investment climate that can see Venezuela exploit its oil resources properly, and in part by making it easier for American firms to invest in Venezuela, many of which were, or the key ones of which, majority of which were turfed out by under Maduro. So these are the actions that have to be taken. And it's very early, but it appears, there's reason to believe, let's put it this way, that at this time, certain of those actions are being taken, certainly to a sufficient extent that the extent of the threat posed to the US out of Venezuela will be markedly reduced, and the prospects for Venezuelan economic recovery will be very much higher.
So, Frans, we're going to stay a little bit longer on Venezuela because I want to ask you about the implications for South Africa around this, given that, Maduro I think Venezuela recently became a part of BRICS nations. There's this kind of long solidarity between leftist governments and the ANC. What can the South Africans learn from what's happened in Venezuela here?
I think there's a lot here to learn because they're very strong parallels. The first thing that strikes you when you look at the Maduro experience is how he miscalculated. If you see that image of him being whisked away from the helipad in New York into jail somewhere, you do think, what was going through his head? Where did this go wrong for me? And there's an answer. If you just take the past 12 months, and sketch a chronology, the warnings to him were plain, and I've done a little list of those. January 10 last year, the US says that his third-term inauguration is essentially fraudulent, which it was. He's not the legitimate winner. There's a message coming to you. Go exactly a month later, Trenda Aragua, which is a crime syndicate, is linked by the US directly as Maduro. They designate that as a foreign terrorist organization and claim that it's a proxy for him and his government. There's a second kind of statement, a message being sent to you, but you ignore it. Go a month after that, US revokes oil concessions, imposes a tariff on Venezuela, on the purchase of Venezuelan oil. So the message is sent a month later. Hey, you're not hearing us. We're slowly ratcheting up the actions here. a couple of weeks after that. He himself is now designated as a global terrorist leader, what's it called, the Cartel of Sons. You used the correct name earlier, Rainer. And there's an arrest bounty now raised on his head. And so, it's not like when you were arrested a few months later that this came as a bolt from the blue. The chain of events is there. Then in September, the maritime counter-narcotics campaign is launched. So the Americans are sailing around the Caribbean. In great style, the Gerald Ford aircraft carrier is sent around. About a month after that, there's a report. I don't know if it's ever been confirmed, but I think it did occur, that Trump puts an ultimatum to Maduro directly and says, hey, you've got to give up. Go find somewhere to live. Turkey might take you, and move with your family. And Maduro says, to hell with you. He just can't see what's coming. About a month after that, the U.S. Navy seizes the first oil tanker, and the quarantine of Venezuelan oil shipments commences, and you get this buildup of the military. Then again, he gets another warning. This is about 3 or 4 weeks ago. The Americans say to him, "Listen, you got to get out of here now. This is your sort of last chance to exit." And subsequent to that, in the events of his seizure and arrest play out. But if you watch his responses throughout this, it's total defiance, dismissiveness. There's even an arrogant confidence that you won't do anything. There's sort of defiant revolutionary statements. To hell with you, and who do you think the US can't? And then, one afternoon, one evening, you find yourself spirited away to face justice in New York. Now, so that's if you look at the relationship with South Africa and the US, it's very different. No one's coming here to depose the head of state, to take them off to prison. None of that's going to happen. Partly because South Africa just doesn't matter enough. Partly because it's a much more democratic society than certainly in relative to Venezuela was. There are a lot of key differences. But there are also similarities. The similarities that you can draw a similar chronology of Americans. You can go back even to the Biden era, the Lady R incident, ratcheting up the pressure. Then the repeated statements of the national security threat that South Africa poses. The repeated concerns about the ties to Iran. The concerns about the fronting of the ICJ case, which is seen in the US very similar to the drug dealing of the Venezuelans. That drug dealing is seen as an attempt not to make money from drugs, partly that, but chiefly to undermine the internal stability of the United States on behalf of its enemies. Now, South Africa's ICJ case is read not just as an attempt to bring a case to the ICJ, but an attempt to destabilize and delegitimize Israel on behalf of America's enemies. So these parallels are very strong. And then there's the meeting in the Oval Office with the South Africans, and the tariffs, and then we're on the higher end of the tariffs, and then there's the threat of sanctions, and all of this is building. It's a very clear parallel. But the South African response is also defiant. To hell with you, the foreign ministry spokesperson suggested a week or so ago that South Africa, if it had nuclear weapons, should employ these in order to take on the Americans. He subsequently withdrew that statement, but I mean, you'd made it. At the recent ANC conference, the party said we must fight the Americans. People with a good memory will remember that the South African ambassador in Venezuela a few years back said that South Africa should lend the Venezuelans our military to help fight and defeat the United States. So there's the similar defiance going on. Similar chain of events, similar defiance. In South Africa's case, there's not going to be a sort of bolt out of the blue and spirited away to New York to face trial. But there'll probably be high levels of tariffs. There'll certainly be no new investment pacts. And in time, we may see South Africa graduate to be on the receiving end of US sanctions and individual political leaders and institutions of the country doing the same. So there's one parallel to learn from. And had Maduro read the writing on the wall early on about where this was going, he could have positioned himself in such a manner to head off the consequences. The second, it's not really a parallel, but it's the lesson I think the South Africans should learn, is the point we made earlier, that this was not regime change. This was not an overthrow of the governing administration in Venezuela and replacing it with the opposition, the exiled opposition. This was just decapitating a problem figure and saying to his deputy Rodriguez, listen here, we're making you an offer you really shouldn't refuse. We have a national security concern and we have a domestic policy and economic concern. And if you address those, then we'll be on good terms with you. Now, the ANC in South Africa, which runs South Africa's foreign policy, seems to be under the impression the Americans wish to pursue regime change here. And I think that's completely wrong. I don't think that's what they want to do at all. I think they identify that there are a small circle of highly problematic figures that run South Africa's foreign policy. And if that circle could be isolated or backed down, and two objectives be met: stop threatening U.S. national security and create domestic policies that make it easier to grow your economy and for American firms to invest, so expropriation and non-tariff barriers, then I think the Americans would very happily do a deal with the existing South African administration. And those are the lessons that I think should be learnt on the South African side. But to date, I don't know if the evidence is overwhelming that they are being learned.
Yeah, so I think that is a great place for us to leave the discussion on Venezuela. But we are going to stay on the topic of South Africa. And we're going to stay with you, Franz, as we are going to talk about the two threats that the GNU faces in 2026. So can you elaborate as to what those two are?
Yeah, we're very big on the GNU and we think it's a great thing and we've supported it very strongly and we said it would happen and we said it would hold through last year. Now, in 2026, there are two things that can happen. They're related to each other that might mean that the GNU does not hold. The first is in late March or April, the DA has a leadership election and it picks a new leader. And John Steenhuisen, who is the leader, is under pressure in the party. He's been a staunch defender of the GNU. I thought he was excellent during the negotiations to form the GNU. I thought he handled those very well under very difficult circumstances to make the GNU happen. I mean, we've been critical of aspects of the DA and the GNU, but overall he's held it together, and he's held it together in the face of sometimes great internal dissent around the DA about whether they should be in the GNU at all, and he's seen off some of those battles and those figures, and I think correctly so, and fortunately so. But the DA has never been united about the idea of the GNU, with good reason. I mean, you can raise arguments against it. One argument, just while we're on it, is force the ANC and the MK into bed together, and the EFF. They'll all discredit each other, and we'll do much better in future elections. And that's an argument worth hearing out. And there's some others as well. If John is replaced as the DA leader, and whoever replaces him, we don't know who that would be, is a person who's not as committed to the GNU as John is, then there's a prospect that the new DA leadership would consider exiting the arrangement or having it brought to an end or whatever the case might be. So that's step one. Watch for that. Step two is the forthcoming local government elections. Now, these will pit the ANC against the DA, and the ANC is going to come off in many respects second best, certainly in the big cities. In a place like Johannesburg, the DA might do much better than the ANC has done. And the campaigning around this election will, of course, force the parties to a campaign and thereby stress each other's weaknesses. And you can see how these two events are related. If you early in the year end up with a DA leader who's not wholly committed to the GNU, and then through the second half of the year, you start a very fraught campaign exercise where the ANC is fears the further electoral humiliation, things hot up a bit. You could easily get a situation where the confluence of those two forces creates an environment where the GNU itself fails. And if put differently, it's the last thing I'll say, if the GNU prevails through this year, it will have prevailed because it will likely have prevailed because it overcame the confluence of those two factors.
So, Franz, before I want to respond to what you're saying and elaborate on some polling we have on attitudes amongst South Africans towards the GNU. But before that, you mentioned that John Steenhuisen is under pressure within the DA. And so what should we expect? I'm not sure if you can kind of if you're willing to put names forward at the moment, but what should we expect from the upcoming leadership battle inside of the DA?
I'm not really sure which way it goes. I don't really know who's got the upper hand in these things or doesn't. I sometimes, I don't really know, Gabriel, where the balance rests. But it's very hard to get a firm answer. I think it's one of those things. But I wouldn't. I would say that it's certainly not the case that he could be confident of continuing as a DA leader. And what people in the DA say is that a very important thing at a conference like that is to instill confidence amongst the broad base of the party, not the members outside, but the sort of politicians, that the party is still on the up and that opportunities to do well in future elections are good, and that people in their careers are essentially safe, which you might think is very cynical and short-sighted, but it obviously matters a great deal to the people involved. And if that can be conveyed strongly, then I think John has a chance of being re-elected, but I wouldn't put odds on it at this stage.
So I would follow up on what you're saying about John's possibility of being removed as the leader of the DA, potentially because of his vocal support and backing for the GNU, causing some ruptures within the party. I would just offer a word of caution about some polling numbers that we have at the Social Research Foundation. So we'll start just on the question about how the GNU is perceived. So we asked the question, South Africa is currently governed by a grand coalition, also called a government of national unity, which comprises a range of parties, including the ANC and DA. In general, do you think the GNU is doing well or poorly? So amongst all voters, there's about 49% think that it's doing well, and about 33% think that it's doing badly or poorly. But then we switch to let's focus then on ANC and DA voters. What do they think? So amongst ANC voters, now 50% think that it's doing well and 23% think that it's doing poorly. And amongst DA voters, 56% think that the GNU overall is doing well, and 33% think that it's doing badly. We then go to the question of party performance inside of the GNU. Now we ask about the ANC. Are they performing well or poorly? Amongst all voters, about 41% think that they're doing well, and 45% think that they're doing badly. But amongst ANC voters, now 63% of ANC voters think that the ANC is doing well inside of the GNU, and only 14% think it's doing poorly. But amongst DA voters, only 22% think that the ANC is doing well, and 68% think that the ANC is doing poorly. But then we come to the DA. So how is the DA doing? And now amongst all voters, just over 60%, about 61% think that they're doing well, and only 23% think that they're doing badly. Amongst ANC voters, 57% think that the DA is doing well inside of the GNU, and only 18% think that it's doing badly. So that's a very important number for the DA to consider. Its position within the GNU is incredibly popular, not just amongst its own voters, which I'll tell you in a second, but amongst ANC voters, which is the biggest share pool of voters and the one with the most questions and the one that we've now been demonstrated in the last election to be the most willing to move. So how do DA voters perceive their party within the GNU? Now, remember, the ANC was about 64% think their party is doing well. Amongst DA voters, 84% of their voters think that the DA is doing well inside of the GNU. So DA voters, and only 7% think that they're doing poorly. So DA voters are more keen on the DA's performance inside of the GNU than ANC voters are keen on the ANC's performance inside of the GNU. So this is an incredibly popular thing for the DA to be a part of. And you mustn't, and so be very cautious about what you're going to do if you're going to change the leadership and invite someone in who is much more negative. You might be inviting in a lot of negative sentiment that attaches to this idea that the DA suddenly goes against the GNU. And then finally, just a last piece, a very, very interesting question we asked in this last poll was, do you agree or disagree with the following statement? If the ANC and DA can form a majority in any municipality or metro after the next local government elections, they should do so and form a coalition together. Amongst all voters, about 59% agree with this idea, and only 36% disagree with the idea. Amongst ANC voters, 73% agree with the idea, and 26% disagree. And amongst DA voters, about 60% agree with the idea, and 35% disagree. So across almost every metric, the DA's participation inside of the GNU is massively beneficial, much more beneficial to them than it is actually to the ANC. It offers ANC voters and potential new voters to the DA an opportunity for the DA to demonstrate its own brand of governance, what it would act like as a governing party, while at the same time being a very popular kind of image for the voters who are already inside of the DA. So, with all of this in mind, the idea that John Steenhuisen should be petrified about the prospect of someone, an anti-GNU crusader, coming in and dethroning him is kind of absurd, given that the achievement of entering the GNU might just be one of the biggest factors that draw voters into the DA, other than anything else that they've done. But I'm going to move on to France. You've got something else you want to say here?
I just want to say that you're right. Because if you look at the data on how DA voters perceive the DA and the GNU, it's very positive and very strong for them. The same data, the flip side of the coin, how ANC voters perceive their party in the GNU is very popular for them. And then the future question in local government elections, if neither party gets an outright majority, should the DA and the ANC work together to form a government, gets extremely strong support, not just from the party voters themselves, but from the broader public too. And it would be a vast political risk to turn against that kind of number and say, actually, we don't think this governing arrangement is in our best interests and we're going to walk out of it.
James?
Isn't there a way of finessing this issue? Because I think there are problems with having us, with the DA leadership sitting in the GNU, which is that you get co-opted into government, and there are all sorts of conflicts of interests that arise between your own personal position and the position of your supporters. Could the DA not sort of split the leadership between the party leader and the leader of government business, who could carry on then being John Steenhuisen?
France, do you want to take that?
Maybe you could. Maybe you have two centers of power. Maybe you now create conflict. It'll be a question of who the leader really is. Does the chap sitting in the cabinet truly represent the party and its interests? Is it the right person to speak to? You can nuance things, sure, but I don't. I'm cautious of trying to pursue a perfect model or better model, either not perfect, a better model, when the model in place is adequate in the much broader sense relative to what it might have been. And this is as the GNU, the South Africa's growth outlook for this year, 2026, isn't good, and so you can be critical of a lot of things. DA co-opted on various things. The ANC people say the ANC's been co-opted on various things. You can be critical of that, rightly so, but the point is too often not taken seriously enough that the alternative could be ANC, EFF, MK, who would implement very aggressively, possibly, the kind of ideas and policies that would do irreparable harm to South Africa's economy and its democracy. And when you start messing with the leadership or tweaking this or tweaking that, you must be very certain that you know exactly what the longer term consequences of that are going to be. And in my own case, just to make my argument a bit better, I think the only way a unitary South African state holds together is for the ANC and the DA to govern the country, because structurally that's all that works. The DA now commands the established middle class market, and the ANC still very influential on the aspirant middle class on the urban fringe. And those are the two voting markets which together give you a 60% odd majority of voters with allied interests and policy expectations. And therefore, structurally, the only way the unitary state works is for the ANC and the DA to work together. And to an extent that is happening at the moment. To me, just the critics of the GNU, you can compare now. I'm astonished how well it's working and how effective it has been. And that, and we anticipated that it would be, but I'm still astonished by it. That the rand is trading at 16.50, partly because of dollar weakened, admittedly, but not at 160, and that inflation is in the new target zone, 3 to 4%, not at 400%. And so that's my relative sense of it, and therefore I'd be wary to tinker with people and a model and a leadership, not being entirely sure what the long-term consequences of that would be.
I feel like that's a great place for us to leave the discussion on South Africa for the moment, and we're going to turn back to some another adversarial American approach, but this time it is some social media campaigners in the United States who have had their visas denied or revoked over concerns for free speech. And so, Simon, this is an issue we've touched on before about the kind of chilling attitude of the UK on free speech, but the US seems to be actively taking a stance against this now. So can you kind of explain everything that's going on here?
I'm also going to be like France and take you up on that word adversarial, just as you were taken up for abduction earlier, because this is not an adversarial approach. This is a consequential approach. And we have to go back to a few points in the last few years to understand what's going on here. But on the 24th of December, Politico were the first to report that the Trump administration had sanctioned 5 individuals, 2 from the UK and 3 from the EU, for their role in the censorship apparatus. And so let's go to the points at which I'd like our audience to remember. Elon Musk announces on X that he'll be interviewing the Republican presidential candidate, Donald J. Trump. Immediately, he is sent a letter by the EU warning him of disinformation. And that letter is signed by a man called Thierry Breton, who is the architect of the Digital Services Act in the European Union. The next point that I want our audience to go to is an appearance that the founder of Unheard, which is like a normie, is partially intellectual media website. A guy called Freddie Sayers, he gets on a video and he says that he was wondering exactly why that media website is reaching between only 2 and 6% of its advertising revenue targets, when he discovers there's a group called the Global Disinformation Index, or GDI, headed by an English woman called Claire Melford, that has been tinkering. Now, by tinkering, I mean that it's been making lists and sending them to advertisers. And Unheard is unaware of this process. She finds issue, Miss Melford at the Global Disinformation Index finds issue with the fact that Unheard is platforming so-called gender-critical feminists like Kathleen Stock, who's a professor in the UK, and Julie Bindel, who's a very well-known and well-regarded writer. What happens next in Unheard's chain of events then is that the advertisers scramble. And they scramble because they've been told this website is presenting disinformation to the public. But a very important point, it's also publishing something called adversarial narratives. That is something that she's come up with. And adversarial narratives is an ambiguous term, but it basically means anyone who's going against the establishment. Then the third point that I want our audience to remember is previous discussion on the book that was written by the fine South African investigative journalist Paul Holden, published last year in the UK, called The Fraud, in which he documents how Morgan McSweeney, who's Keir Starmer's chief of staff, was very good buddies with a guy called Imran Ahmed, and they formed together a disinformation busting movement that was funded by money that hasn't yet been declared to the Electoral Commission, by the way. It's quite an important thing. And that went on. It mutated into the Center for the Center for Digital Hate in the US, and this is an organization that has been actively targeting Elon Musk. Leaked notes from one of its briefings have revealed that their primary objective was to kill Musk's Twitter quote. So there are 3 individuals, Imran Ahmed, Thierry Breton, and Claire Melford have all been sanctioned on Christmas Eve. Sanctioned is, we must look at this because it's not technically a sanction. It's just America saying, we don't want you in the country. We believe that you have done enough damage, and so we're going to revoke your visas or your green cards, and you're not coming to America. Now, the point that I made for the Common Sense for France last week, I think it was to look at how the response to this news emerged. And I'm of the view that if there wasn't censorship in Europe, then there's no need to have such an orchestrated, systematic response. And we saw that unfolding. We saw the European Union come out and say, this is absolutely terrible. We saw lobby groups, and then like a wave of tech bros, irrelevant tech bros, coming out and saying, no, America and Europe must divorce, and all of that. The fact is that there is censorship in the EU. And I point to an article that has been published this morning by the Wall Street Journal outlining the case of the retired Swiss colonel who writes books and appears on podcasts with a very assertive view on the events in Ukraine, in which he feels that there was involvement of third parties, and that things aren't as they appear there. Now, we don't have to agree with that, okay? This recites Swiss kernel. You can eat your cheese. You can do whatever you want. You're allowed to say that. The European Union has sanctioned him. They have sanctioned him. He is not allowed to travel to any of the 27 member states for doing that. So I'm of the view that for the last few years, we've been talking about how these sorts of people, like Claire Melford, who go around and get advertisers to remove their business from the news websites, resulting in ordinarily the loss of jobs at the lower end of the company structure. It leaves organizations scrambling to have to pay their writers. They don't know how, this is a very important feature. And the describing of a website as being adversarial narrative is very chilling, because we go back to the response again and we see that actually what's happening here is that there's not only censorship, but there's encouraging to think in a specific way, to think like Ed Davey or Mark Carney, to see the world in that view, and everything else is intolerable. So we've been, as I said, we've been waiting for consequences for a while for this, and they emerged on Christmas Eve. The following morning, Marco Rubio's deputy makes a meme on Twitter, putting herself in a Santa hat like the ones that Gabriel made us wear for the last episode last year, and she says, "Merry Christmas, Morgan McSweeney." And this is a very interesting thing here. Morgan McSweeney is the power in Downing Street. There's a power outside that, but he's the guy that controls things. And if the Americans have got him in their sights for the stuff that he did exposed by Paul Holden, then this hasn't ended. Then we're just at a little bit of an interlude, and that there will be more consequences. And I'm very happy for consequences if they are, and that Emmanuel Macron coming out and saying we have freedom of speech and this is itself censorship. It's not. You take the guy's green card away, he's not allowed to travel. America's got a 100% right to determine who comes in and who doesn't. And if these sorts of people they don't agree with, then I'm sorry, it's the way it is. You shouldn't have behaved as you did. And yeah, so I'm very supportive of this, and I hope that there'll be even more, because this is a really, really set, established thing in the continent now. You have all these groups doing all these funny little things, all these centers, all this tinkering. And I do think that the European Union will actually pause now, because Trump has proved it's the rubber's hit the road. This is it. We're not going to say there are going to be consequences. There are actually going to be consequences. So I think it's a good thing.
So it's very interesting that a kind of theme seems to be emerging amongst the various stories we've talked about touching on America, that the initial phases of the American response is to demonstrate we are getting serious about this issue. So we talked about it with Venezuela, as France laid out the kind of series of events and the warnings that Maduro received. Then France, you mentioned the series of events and the warnings that the South Africans have received. But just like, and now Simon, you've brought up that, this is an issue that the Trump administration has been pushing since they took office. And so it seems as though, 2025 was the year in which you let people FA, and now we're in the year in which we're finding out.
Correct. Exactly right. And yeah, I don't know who can really criticize this stuff. There are a number of South African commentators that I've read and I don't pay much attention to, but they seem to be very upset. But have you seen what these guys have done? Ofcom, the Online Services Act, the Digital Services Act, all of these things are not good. They are fundamentally opposed to the exchange of ideas. And yeah, so, find out.
James?
Yeah, I just want to say that these guys don't, well, from my personal experience of them, is that they don't, it's not actually disinformation that they're concerned with. It's often information that's both true and in the public interest, but is seen as threatening to a sort of quite a narrow elite class. So this disinformation argument is I think misdirection. I mean, if your opponents in public debate spew false information, that's an absolute gift, because you can just hammer them and hammer their credibility in response. The other aspect of it is it's all secret. So you don't, as a publisher, you have these guys doing these reports, and it happens in South Africa as well, and you ask them for the reports and they refuse to provide them. So it's not like a sort of obvious censorship regime where you know, there's it could be a Streisand effect, you know, an attempt to obviously censor something leads to it becoming more and more prominent. You as a publisher don't even know you're being censored. You suddenly your results on Google disappear, and suddenly you're no longer getting the ad revenue you received. And there's all this sort of shadow banning, and you don't even know what the article was that you know, offended someone. So it when it's operationalized, it's deeply sinister and it's impossible to deal with. You all you see is suddenly your traffic has disappeared, your search results have disappeared. I found that Politics Web, which I edit, was being censored because I tried to find an article on my own website and I couldn't find it because it had been, that topic had either Politics Web or that particular topic had been, you know, decreed as you know, dangerous information, and you get no notice, you get no explanation, you get no warning. It just suddenly, you know, your articles aren't appearing, you know, on Google. Suddenly, half your traffic has disappeared. So this is a deeply sinister censorship apparatus that they in fact did put in place, and that it's only Elon Musk, when he took over Twitter, that broke that. So it's much. It's to say that this is about disinformation. I think is as I said, it is pure misdirection.
Yeah, and just to follow, if I can follow up with you on that, because what's the next step for this? So you've got this thing. It's basically already in motion when you start taking someone's bank account from them, debanking them, and then they can't pay because PayPal have. So you got to. This role is like one step in a stage to completely deperson someone. You take their views down. You take their conveniences, maybe even internet banking and so on. It's a really, really terrible thing. And I just hope that there are just more and more consequences until people get the message.
Yeah, I think we're going to stay. We're going to slightly change the topic, but the broad theme is going to stay about the same, about the change in attitudes in the Americans. And it's a follow-up to an article you mentioned, Simon, earlier, in a previous episode, Jacob Savage's brilliant article. But James, you're going to kind of explain and flesh out more what that article says, and then we can, you know, move on from there.
Yeah, it's basically this, as you mentioned, Simon mentioned it previously, but then it's really took off in December, on the uncensored internet. I think had it not had this sort of censorship apparatus been in place, it wouldn't have. So that and it's an article by this guy called Jacob Savage, who was a aspirant scriptwriter in Hollywood, I think. And it was published in Compact magazine in mid-December. And what it does in a very calm, sort of rational, sort of melancholic way is document the experience of young white millennial men from about 2014 onwards, who were trying to make careers in academia, in Hollywood as scriptwriters, as Savage as Savage was, and also in journalism. And what he describes is you know, with this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the racial reckoning, and this emphasis on promoting women and people of color, and which became a sort of obsession. And he documents, you know, what it was like to be at the receiving end of that. and essentially, if you were a straight white male, in that era, in those particular fields, you had no chance. People, if you fit the right demographic criteria, you were on this escalator sort of upwards, into tenure track positions, or into promotions in journalism, or in Hollywood, as but if you didn't fit the demographic criteria, i.e. you were straight, you were white, and you were male, no matter how hard you tried, unless you were like this absolutely super talented, lucky person, you were knocked back and knocked back and knocked back. And this is what he documents in this piece. And it got very hugely well read in the United States. And Simon will talk, I think, about its impact in the UK. But just speaking as a sort of South African, after what South Africans have experienced, it was actually quite shocking. I mean, these are young guys, probably all sort of share the basic liberal ideas of that generation, and they were absolutely hammered. It's like reading about an experience of a Afrikaner policeman in Jackie Celebi's SAPS, just knocked endlessly and being knocked back on the basis of your race and gender. So it's quite, and to see it happening in a Western liberal democracy is also completely bizarre. I mean, you read the sort of thing in when you're Chinese in Indonesia, or an Indian in post-colonial Uganda. Or a Jewish person in the Middle East before the establishment of the State of Israel, of absolute ethnic discrimination, and yet it's not happening in some sort of third world post-colonial disaster zone. It's happening in America. So that, I think, is the first point. So it's what he describes as actually is shocking, even from a South African point of view. But the second thought I had was it's actually not surprising, because in South Africa there was something very similar that happened when the ANC took over. They historically they had always been committed to a very aggressive Africanization program after seizing power. That the term Africanization had become discredited by what had happened in post-colonial Africa, but they were able to sort of restart that program under the name of affirmative action, because of the sort of ideological support from America. And you always felt with South Africa, the ANC were driven, by when the ANC drove that policy, the sort of most aggressive people were always the Americans who came in to support it. So I always had the feeling that, there was this class of progressive Americans who absolutely loved the ANC, absolutely loved what it was doing in South Africa. And my sense at the time was, well, this is what they would really like to be doing in America, but they can't because it's a different country demographically. But then what you had after 2014 is suddenly that class of American sort of racial leftist suddenly had the chance to implement their racial program that they'd, supported in South Africa, and then they applied it against their own children. I mean, it's completely sort of grotesque in a way. And what Jacob Savage, describes as, if you were born after 1980, you got absolutely hammered. If you were, a boomer or a Generation X, you're already established in your profession, and it suited you to go along with this. So often the villains in his piece were these older white men who in pursuit of these racial and ethnic and gender goals, sacrificed this younger generation. And this is a younger generation who grown up in completely mixed circumstances in schools where they weren't even necessarily in the majority or anything. So they had none of the racial privileges of the older generation. But the older generation was in a way sacrificing their children on the altar of this sort of racial, politics. So then I think the third point is, I think, if I was in DERCO or the ANC and I want to understand why suddenly this Trump administration is meeting giving a hearing to these Afrikaners, it's because there is a generation of young American men who've really felt the sting of racial discrimination, and it's changed it's changed their attitudes, and I think it's changed their attitudes to South Africa, and they see in South Africa a sort of precursor of what they subsequently experienced. So, the previous boomer generation would have been very supportive of the ANC and what it was doing. This generation, because it's experienced this discrimination, is much more critical of what the ANC has done, and much more sympathetic to Afrikaners and what they experienced under ANC rule.
So I think I'm going to go to France and then to you, Simon.
I don't know if the lesson extends to the US experience, but you make the example of this Afrikaner policeman after 1994 who had a very difficult time. But what I might just raise as something we can talk about is what subsequently happens is that chap is forced out of the civil service, and it must be very difficult and all these things. So I'm not saying it's not that, but he becomes the owner of a private security business, becomes very successful, employs his own staff, later does work on behalf of all sorts of entities that can no longer rely on the police because the police is no longer able to fulfill its functions. Time and time again in South Africa, these examples stand up to the point that they become a pattern. The pattern becomes so pronounced that I make the argument for you that affirmative action in South Africa empowers the whites. They come off the back of their confidence in the apartheid state to an extent that shattered the safety of employment in the civil service for those who had it and protected whatever else for those who had that. And they face this, which must have been a very harsh reality, but they become very successful, and they actually are better off today as a consequence than they would have been had they remained in the civil service. And there's another side to that black South Africans had, certainly when the ANC was absent, which it was for such a long time, quite bravely stood up against the might of the apartheid system independently, and brought it down. The famous book of our now dead friend John Cain Berman, The Silent Revolution, brought down apartheid really before the ANC returned to the country to claim victory. They're disempowered. There's this dependency on the state, on tenders, on the like. And that maybe it's just unique to the South African experience, maybe it will still manifest in the West. But that ultimately, if you do an accounting of affirmative action policies here after 1994 and you can only reach one crude conclusion, it would be that they were greatly to the advantage of the whites and not to any great extent to the advantage of their intended beneficiaries.
James, would you like to respond to that, or should I move to Simon?
I can respond. I think it's sort of, in a way, it was worse and therefore better. Is that what Savage describes as he didn't realize that the system had changed. That in fact you didn't have any prospects. So you sort of tried and you wasted 10 years of your life trying. While in about 96, 97, if you were white in the civil service, the ANC had said, look, you can stay, but you'll never get another promotion in your life. And they delivered on that promise for the guys who couldn't get out. And so then, so from thinking, being very state orientated, and the state's going to look after you. There was this huge shock, and you had to try and make your way in the private sector and whatever. But also there was massive immigration, so that was the other way of adapting, and that has been a catastrophe for South Africa. The loss of skills abroad. So as long as the guy stayed in South Africa and set up his business, then the society carried, but if those people left, then those skills and enterprise and whatever was lost to the country. But I suppose the rules were clearer in South Africa, so one could adapt. But this, in America, for whatever reason, you would think that, if one part of the is Hollywood is excluding talented guys on the basis of their race, another part would be profiting off that by employing them, and the same with journalism or whatever. But this appeared to have been and academia. It appeared to be totally across the board. So if you were looking for progress in those fields, you had no chance. And I suppose it was much more sort of competitive in America. I mean, I think men and white men are already in sort of in trouble, So it was probably also harder to try and carve out your own spaces as well.
I agree that's to the loss of South Africa, but certainly the immigration. If you can calculate the tax that was lost, it's an enormous sum of money. But even the immigrants who left, the young whites, they left an economy that was 0.5% of global GDP, and they moved out into the world. Many of them keep trying to come back, including some here. But I think that, and I wonder another thing, James, whether the enforcement of this stuff in the West and in America wasn't much more sincere and ruthless and fundamentalist and almost cruel than it was in SA. Because the ANC, which this was its policy and it drove it. It's the ANC would face a lot of sort of black nationalist critics who would say you guys really didn't do this properly at all. And at every junction, not every junction, but very often the ANC sends, or at critical points, the ANC tends to overlook its own ideology in the appointments that it makes. Not always, certainly not, but when the chips are down and things are tough, very often the ideology is not at the forefront of the decision that gets taken. And I wonder whether the way it was applied in the West, therefore, wasn't much more ruthless than, and maybe that's the point. I don't know if it's true, but maybe that would be one of the points. Much more ruthless than the implication in South Africa, which was such a sort of gold standard of this sort of thing.
I mean, just my personal experiences is that on the individual level, there's a kind of we'll do it, but we kind of feel slightly embarrassed about it in South Africa. While when it came to the Americans, it was total fanaticism.
Yes,
and about South Africa, exactly. It's like
yes.
If you ever sort of challenged America saying there's this discrimination in South Africa, which is wrong, you'd get this diatribe against you personally. How dare you, as a white South African, you think you have the impertinence to claim equal treatment in your society, which you'd never get from a black South African. Well, I've never experienced it, and having been involved in these debates for decades. So there's a sort of ideologically driven, deeply sort of self-righteous thing in America, which sort of welled up from within these elite institutions. So when I saw what had happened, I mean, it didn't surprise me. But it did shock me.
Simon, I think you can contribute here about the United Kingdom experience.
Sure. So just from a response perspective to James mentioned earlier that it had received enormous uptake in it's probably Compact Mag's biggest read article of all time, and certainly for me it was the article of 2025. I found it interesting speaking to a couple of UK journalists, centre right from the Telegraph, about it, because they had, like I did, and when I first brought up the book, the article, I said that I was trying to, I wanted to find something that was able to explain a few anomalies to me. The jobs market in the UK, you can't just blame everything on the economy, as disastrous as it is. It is in practice that BAME, that's the word that they use in the UK. It's such a stupid word, but that's the description in the UK. Candidates are preferred. There are internships offered by the institutions, the likes of the BBC, even the military, MI6 and MI5. There are internships that are exclusive to people of color. Cambridge University has a research program for postgraduates, which is exclusive to people of color. So that you got that. Then you got the suicide rates of young white people in England, and they don't publish these things. It's not widely known, but it's pretty damn shocking. Okay, and you can't just go, well, Sweden has so many suicides on the 5th of January every year. It's not like that. And I thought that what Jacob Savage managed to do was to weave a couple of these loose strands together really nicely. And one of the English journalists said to me, look, this is it for us. It's horrendous reading because we all see it, but we also see the people who believe in those things, the generations that James mentioned who were actively advocating for this. And that is your Labour politician who's aged between 20 and 70. It's also your Liberal Democrats. It's that emerging Islamo-left alliance. It's your activist judiciary. It's your media executives. It's all of these people that are in highly influential positions. And I was very, just to finish the point, I felt that conclusion to that article, Savage, was quite cryptic, because there's a little bit of space to what else I spoke about, which is the reflex we are inevitably going to feel at some point. And that is the generation of 14, 15-year-olds who've watched this unfold. And when they come to full political maturity, I'm afraid that that's when you're looking 10 years' time. You'll probably see the true effect of this in the form of resistance. And James, also just mentioned, is that Pied Piper guys, we've got Nick Fuentes, we've got Zach Polanski, this teeth jumping out from all directions, like every man for himself. He should be sectioned under the Dental Health Act. That's their best line about him. But you've got him, you've got all of these guys. But in Fuentes' case, I see like that guy who's the son of the former Republican leadership contender, Nikki Haley, has gone on to one of these podcasts and spoken about his group of friends' experience in trying to find jobs. I understand. I don't agree with what Fuentes is doing, but I do understand why there is this move, because there's a lot of the young guys that are feeling completely disenfranchised. Work, social, they've had the Me Too movement and what that did to awareness and so on. You've had the consequences to the George Floyd riots. And we're in for something here. And it's not just the US, it's the UK, it's South Africa, maybe, but Canada, Australia, all of the English-speaking countries.
France, to you?
Yeah, that's so spot on when you talk about the 14 and 15-year-olds. And James said that these Americans are kind of open to the Afrikaners because they've got some experience of this sort of things, that they identify with it. And there's this, it seems, eternal inability of a current generation to anticipate that the cruelty and stupidity of its contemporary policies will bring about a counter reaction in the fullness of time. And I mean, I just think for people listening to this, if you look longer term into the future of the world and the future of the Western world, the prospects of a real sort of swing towards the harder right is there to a greater extent than it is already visible, because of the consequence of these younger generations that lived through this stuff, sort of becoming young adults, getting into the economy, feeling alienated on every score, from relationships to their careers to the opportunities they were offered, becoming angry and becoming populist. And I'd be very surprised if this prediction of the swing towards the right did not manifest across the Western world over much of the next 10 to 20 years.
Yeah, so I think this is the episode of taking issue with wording, because I want to take issue with one of the wordings that I think it was you, Franz, talking about the exodus of the whites from the country, and the kind of talent. And I don't think that it's accurate to say that it was only talented white people that have left due to the kind of perception that there is no future in South Africa because of the perceived discrimination. There are countless, and I've met plenty in my kind of experience of being in the Netherlands, being in the UK, that there are almost as many colored and Indian people who have left the country who have as talented, because it is the sense that there is no space for us. And it's not it I think it is inaccurate to portray it as a black and white issue, that there's the discrimination kind of has this chilling effect on all talent. And then the second point that I'd like to kind of talk to as one of maybe as the younger generation of this podcast is, you see it a lot when I talk to I have a younger brother who's 3 years younger, and it seems as though, my year and the kind of years around me are the start of this more conservative shift. All my friends, or mainly all of the people from Bishops, are much more conservative in their kind of outlook and much more right-leaning. But then what becomes more and more chilling is that the younger people get, and the more that they've been exposed to these very extremist voices on the internet, the more hardline they become. And so you talk about how this rightward shift is coming. I think it's already come, and you can see it in these flare-ups of popularity of people like Andrew Tate, who who have a reprehensible view of the world and of women and of but they are so popular because they are, they stand as a juxtaposition against the kind of nonsense that these kids have been fed.
When were you born?
1999.
Sure.
When you were about 12 or 13, I worked on an early research project on immigration. So this is about a decade into the transition. And it showed a remarkable thing, that there was a chunk missing of about 1 million people from the white population. And we could identify where it was in the age structure. There were less whites aged, I think, 24 to 30, or let's say 25 to 35, than 60 to 65. And we knew that they'd left in that decade because their parents were still present in the data above them. And they couldn't have left before because they would have been too young. And they were the first response to, there were three things that happened to them. One is the limitations placed on their prospects. The second was violent crime, and the third was the ability to leave. And where those three circles intersected in a Venn diagram, as Kamala Harris would have enjoyed it, that person left. And at the time that happened, but because of the skills-based nature of the country, black immigration hadn't really become a thing at all. There were a couple of nurses and so on in the Middle East, but that was about the bulk of it. Subsequently, as you became of age, and your generation, which you spoke of now, South Africa's economic prospects turn, and this broader middle class concern rises about the whether the country offers people a stable and prosperous future. And then what starts to begin to happen, the macro data, population data, it's too small to see it in that data like we could see with the whites all those years ago. You start to see that skilled people start to exit. If you look at South Africa's matric class of any of the recent years, the top graduates all go to university overseas because they're, which wouldn't have happened before. Maybe one or two, but not universally across the board. And I was told of a university graduation event at a leading South African high school last year where when some American group that gets kids to study abroad came to present, the venue was packed to capacity, overflow. When one of South Africa's former top universities appeared, I'm told there were almost no people in attendance at all. And this is one of the elite Ivy League high schools in the country. And
Yeah, just on to kind of give you more perspective on that point. From my year at Bishop's, there was 150 boys who were in my year. 30 of them are living in London. Just in London. That's not taking I think it's about just over 50% are not in the country anymore. So that's a kind of, and I can guarantee you that if you were to take the kind of academic performance list, everyone that sat in the top half of the school, almost everyone who sat in the top half of the school are the people who are not in the country anymore. But to you, Simon, then to you, James.
Yeah, I just want to as we've been talking here, I've been kind of measuring the responses that are potentially emerging, and South Africa, France will have a different reception in this because it was law, it was legislated. Companies had to behave in certain ways, and you're sitting there as an American or an Englishman, and you're watching this, and you're going, well, it's not good, but it did go into Parliament. Okay, the guys in America James is talking about, they weren't compelled by law. They did this because they've got some social justice spunk bubble running around their brains, and they think that they're making the difference. It's the same with the guys in England, and those are the sorts of people you see in these positions of authority that I was going to say. They've got it coming to them. It's FO time for them as well.
James.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so as an older generation to Gabriel, in the mid-90s, all the companies, even before the laws in places, were pushing very aggressive affirmative action programs, and sort of understandable at the time. But it got sort of pushed, so one heard stories about this all the time. But about particular companies, and at a certain point, a number of those companies ceased functioning in South Africa. So there was no longer the institution left to promote people. So there were two refineries in Durban, which used to be operational. I think neither of them are there anymore. So if you're a chemical engineer, where are you going to find work? It's not in the refineries in Durban anymore. You have to look elsewhere in the country. And from what I remember, I mean, those refineries applied very, very aggressive affirmative action programs, often irrationally so. Well, there's one in particular I heard about. And so after a while, it doesn't matter what, if the refinery is no longer there, it doesn't matter what color you are, you now have to look elsewhere, look abroad to progress in life. So this stuff, it initially is targeting one group, or the coloreds and Indians were sort of somewhat in the middle there. Although they're also very negatively affected in many places. But in the end, if the institution collapses because management is incompetent or whatever, then that means every young kid of whatever race has to look somewhere else if they're going to progress in life.
Yeah, I think we should leave this incredible discussion. We might at another point pick it up, because I think there's still much that could be talked about. But I'm going to ask the audience to bear with us as we do a quick double act, because as I promised, a little bit of a chat about the new NPA boss and Iran. And so, Franz, can you, in a lightning round, take us through the new NPA boss and then into the Iranian regime?
And I'll do those separately. There's the National Prosecuting Authority was headed by, since February of 2019, by a woman called Shamila Batoy, and her career there is now coming to an end, and she will be replaced by a chap by the name of, he's an advocate, Andy Motibi. He won his law degree from Northwest University in 1987, was a state prosecutor, worked in risk functions for some of the banks, and has run a sort of asset recovery unit that recovers assets from organized crime for the past several years. And an interesting thing happens again, in that the appointment of Advocate Matibi raises a conversation we've heard before, which is this some sort of horizon on which mass prosecutions will now take place? And our advice on that is no. And the reason for that is this, that inside the South African state, there's a strong sense that the impression must be created that prosecutions are being pursued. But that impression must not advance to the point of actual high-level prosecutions, for fear that the extent of the rot in the state and in the ANC in particular is so deep that the first successful prosecutions would set off a chain reaction where people outed each other as they were one by one dragged off to prison, and that the destabilizing effects of that might be so great that the ANC might not survive it. And it's really for that reason that the remarkable thing about the career of Batoy, which is now coming to an end, is that she made it through from 2019 without having to secure one senior high-level state capture, prosecution, and imprisonment. And given the extent of the evidence that just lay to be gathered on the surface, whether exposed by the media or the Gupta leaks or the Zondo Commission or the many other commissions or the reports of the Auditor General or the cases opened with the police, that for all of that, not a single senior official, and by senior I mean someone who, when you hear the name, you say, yeah, that person probably had an influential role in running the country. No one that ran the country through the state capture years has been prosecuted and imprisoned. And that completes the point, that the objective is to create the impression, but not to advance the prosecutions themselves. And that won't change under this chap, despite what may be his best efforts, because enough of the institutional deck will be stacked against him to ensure that he cannot be successful. James.
I think maybe I've made this point before, but I'm not sure. But the National Prosecuting Authority was, if you understand the history, really set up to protect the ANC from prosecution. It was a way of implementing ANC control of the entire prosecution service. So any NDPP who fails to prosecute high-level corruption is actually doing his job. And if he sort of went rogue, as Vusi Piccoli did, then there's a serious problem. So for Andy Matibi, if he does his job, he won't prosecute. If something goes wrong, then he will. So, but it's just, one should just be realistic about why the National Prosecuting Authority is in place. It's not to actually prosecute; it's to protect senior ANC leaders, and there were very good reasons for why the ANC did that at the time that they did.
Yeah, that's the history of, what was the chap's name, McNally in Natal, the prosecutor who went after people, and then the independence of the prosecution service was reined in. Because I must go back to the names. We'll do a show on this one day, but there was quite early on, there were some prominent examples of independent prosecutors going after people, and the new administration thought, hell no, this can't be allowed to stand. And so the independence was essentially compromised. And if the chief prosecutor is appointed by a political figure, it's very difficult that the prosecution service acts at odds with what the political leadership believes in the best long-term interests of their party and organization. So no mass prosecution, but just don't. That doesn't have to depress the person either, because it doesn't actually work in practice. Because if the political leadership does not properly address public frustration at state capture and corruption through prosecutions, which would do so very effectively, the credibility of that political leadership is itself reduced. And we saw that in 2024 when the ANC saw its majority slip to 40%. So the hope that, well, we can politically manage the prosecution service to ensure that none of us goes to prison and loses their positions, probably lost far greater number of positions as the political consequences of the dearth of prosecutions influenced the public mind and contributed to different voting decisions.
So I think, as you said, France, we will do a much fuller story on the history of the National Prosecuting Authority at another point, but let's move on to our last topic, which is Iran.
Yeah, very interesting. The Iranians have had a hard time for a while. Their currency has depreciated considerably. And in a brief potted history, that made it very difficult for merchants and the middle classes to either import and trade or purchase the goods that they'd previously enjoyed. And as a consequence of that, chain of events leads to protests on the streets of major Iranian cities. And there are other things going on. There's water shortages in around Tehran, for example. There's significant corruption through the military and popular frustrations. And you got these high-level protests that have been in the global news in recent weeks. So we did some digging. We found some polling done on Iran, some of it done for the Iranian government itself and not publicly available, but to give it a sense of where the balance of things are. And it doesn't look good. 92% of Iranians say that their country is moving in the wrong direction. 51% think that Israel has been successful in pursuing its objectives against Iran, with only 16% thinking Iran is successful in pursuing its objectives in the region. 62% of Iranians support negotiating a deal with the US to put an end to their conflict. Only 1 in 5 Iranians, 22%, oppose striking a deal with the Americans. More Iranians support ending the nuclear program, 47%, and uranium enrichment, than the 1/3, 36%, who support the program. 70%, or 69% of Iranians say that the Iranian leadership should stop calling for pursuing the destruction of Israel. Only 1 in 5 Iranians now supports the destruction of Israel. 45% of Iranians support women being forced to wear headscarves. 45% oppose it, 41% support it, so that's split half-half. But they don't support, even the ones that support it, don't support enforcing it on women who don't agree to do it. And if you're an ideologically inspired kind of religious leadership administration, this will frighten you. Only half of Iranians have strong religious leanings, and 2/3, or just over 62%. Again, the same as the headscarf number, 62% say that employment in the civil service should not be based or determined by a person's religious beliefs. And if you add the economic data together with this opinion data, it becomes very, it must be very concerning to the Iranian leadership about whether they can maintain control into the longer term, because their religious ideological objectives and the economic consequences of those are wholly at odds with the views and opinions of the great majority of their own people. And therefore, the prospect of the regime in Tehran falling is very great. And I want to go a step on from that and say that this concerns the regime in Iran falling concerns some very sharp Western security thinkers, because they also anticipate that Iran could easily become a moderate cosmopolitan kind of society, the sort of place go on holiday and a woman could dress as they please and parade around on the beaches. And the concern is that if that happens and Iran moderates and becomes cosmopolitan and kind of nice and great place to go on holiday, then within a generation, the Saudis, Jordan, Egypt, the Emirates will lose their fear of Iran. And if that fear is lost, then the basis upon which the Abraham Accords have been constructed will collapse. And if the Abraham Accords collapse, Israel is finished, because its security in the Middle East depends on the alliance with the Arab states against Iran. And within a generation, the broader Middle Eastern society, now without its fear of Iranian influence, will turn to look at Israel and the Jews and say, well, what are you still doing there? And Israel won't be able to stand. So the protests in Iran have an economic origin, but they have been triggered by a much deeper problem for the Iranian administration. And that problem poses a risk not just to the Iranians, but to some very sharp Western national security thinkers who worry in the fullness of time about what happens to Israel if Iran goes cosmopolitan.
Thank you, Franz. I think that is a great place to leave today's episode. And thank you to our wonderful audience for tuning into this first episode of 2026. Thank you to our STEAM panel for your wonderful contributions. Just remember to all of the audience members who are still here that the Common Sense is not just a podcast, it is also a website. You can find that website at thecommonsense.co.za. And I implore you to go and do that in the wait for next week's episode. But be sure to tune back in next week to catch another episode of South Africa's and the world's best news podcast. I've been Gabriel Makin, and this has been Makin Sense.